The world as we know it is changing dramatically and somewhat irreversibly. And this whole change issue is also applicable to military technologies employed by different actors. And of course, the concept of military welfare is also affected. The war in Ukraine, which is still ongoing, the war in Karabakh back in 2020, some of the Israeli operations in Gaza testify to some of the new technologies employed by different actors. And today I'm delighted to have a guest, Mr. John Spencer, who is an eminent expert specializing particularly in urban warfare tactics, and he's a former soldier, retired soldier major. Thank you very much indeed for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
As I mentioned earlier, the world is changing dramatically and somewhat irreversibly. When it comes to warfare tactics, what is the essence of the most fundamental change which is happening now and the impact of which will continue to reverberate for the next few decades?
I think the biggest evolution is just the world has gotten more urbanized. We live in more cities than we don't, and that happened a few years ago, but also immense population growth around those urban areas. So even in places like Europe in World War II, where there were these major battles, there weren't as many people in the way or cities in the way. So we're seeing battles like in Ukraine, where there were wars in World War II and the urban didn't play as much as a factor. But also there's been a kind of, in this peace dividend, nobody wants war, that people believe they don't need big militaries, that technology will prevent that. And actually what we've seen is, no, you still need mass and size. So there's lots of lessons, but the big thing for the urban warfare is that we used to fight for cities, and exponentially people fight in cities for cities now. Because of that smaller military, bigger urban areas, that's a huge factor in the wars today.
And quite a lot has been said about ongoing conflict in Ukraine. It looks like on the battlefield currently Ukraine is not winning, but some people are talking about long-term consequences of what's happening here. What are your major takeaways from the conflict in Ukraine so far? And what do you think they actually tell us about what is to come next?
I mean, since February 2022, the war in Ukraine has evolved multiple times to what was going on. Of course, there's always a scale issue. And Ukraine needed supplies. They had the will. War is a contest of will. Ukrainians voted with their lives to say that they wanted to be free, but you had to have capabilities. And the world, I don't think, decided they wanted Ukraine to win, but they didn't want them to lose. So now it's more of this positional warfare with both sides struggling to maintain the size that they need. Of course, Russia's way bigger than Ukraine and is willing to sacrifice their soldiers way more than any other really nation. But war is politics by other means, and who are your allies, all that's important. So this has really been a test of the global international order that we established after World War II, not to have big wars. Don't start wars of aggression. There's a lot of issues here that are at play that some people recognize and others don't. From a warfare perspective, of course, Ukraine struggles to maintain its geographical line because it's not that big of a military and it doesn't have that much equipment. So it's an evolution, but what I find is people believe that it's just a straight numbers game. War is human. War is about many factors, especially just the will to fight, but even geopolitically.
You know a great deal about the Second Karabakh War, which took place back in 2020, and the fundamental elements there. The crucial battle was Battle of Shusha, which was effectively defined the result of the war, and there was the elements of urban warfare tactics were perfectly applicable to that particular battle as well. What are your major takeaways from that?
There's a lot, and that's why I'm back to study in more detail. Of course, it was the decisive battle that decided the Second Karabakh War. But there are so many elements that most people think that you fight an urban area one way. You surround it and you attack it. And the Battle of Shusha is another example of using deceptions, climbing the cliffs that nobody thought were possible to climb. Many elements that actually achieve your goal, which in this case was really hard to do since you don't want to damage a single part of the city, but you want to liberate it or reclaim it. There's so many lessons from an urban warfare perspective that I've taken from the war, but you had to understand the road to Shusha as well, not just the fight for Shusha.
Indeed, and you examined many battles that happened throughout the century. Are there any other examples similar to what happened in Shusha back in November 2020 in terms of military forces attacking certain place, trying to liberate it with the fundamental purpose of not damaging the city and also minimizing human casualties?
There are other operations, but definitely in modern times, it's probably one of the most unique. I mean, I can go back to like ancient Jerusalem where King David infiltrates through the sewers to take the city from within, not to destroy it, and other elements, or there's a famous a mosque and a church and things that you're not trying to hurt. But at this scale, no, it's got a very unique perspective in modern warfare of how the other factors, and again, people study military, they think that the military just does what it wants. There's always constraints, and Susha is a very unique one.
Well, Azerbaijan is a medium-sized country. Geographically, it's not very big, of course, but militarily, it's quite strong. There are those who believe that it's a medium-sized power. It's growing. Its clout is increasing as well. And we earlier talked about Ukraine. Ukraine is much smaller than Russia, of course. What does the war in Ukraine, and perhaps some of the things related to Azerbaijan, tell us about a reasonably small country using its own technological prowess and leveraging it against a bigger adversary? When we talk about bigger adversary, of course, we refer to Ukraine.
Yeah, one of the biggest ones is just the revolution of military affairs. This system, some people call it the NATO system, or just a Western way of having a professional military that is well trained, well motivated, well fed. You know that you care about every individual soldier. That's the superpower. And Azerbaijan shows that evolution to a NATO Western style of professional military, same thing Ukraine was already evolving from 2014 on, is superior to the other industrial Soviet model of just throwing men into battle. That's definitely a lesson that can be taken from both.
Now, one of your recent papers, published very recently, it's about subterranean warfare in relation to some of the Israeli operations in Gaza. They have been praised by many people. Some people criticize you as well. We know that. What is the fundamental argument there? And do you think Israeli operations in Gaza, from that perspective, has been largely successful and could be replicated in many ways by other actors?
Yeah, absolutely. I hope that we don't have to see another Israeli situation like Gaza, where you have this really terrorist regime that builds a world that is meant to sacrifice its civilians to achieve their political goal, which is to destroy the other nation. So it's not about land, it's literally to destroy the other nation. The subterranean that they built underneath their civilians was very unique, but would have challenged any military of the world, the US military, any military. And Israel figured out a way to turn the underground into an advantage. So they started attacking into the underground at the same time they're attacking on the surface to achieve their goals while protecting civilians. That will be a lesson really for the future of warfare, that the underground is not just a defensive obstacle that you have to deal with. It's actually a terrain that you can use to maneuver if you're good enough.
Thank you very much indeed. John Spencer, I'm so grateful to you for your time, for your very detailed answers.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you.